She was 3 days from marrying the most dangerous man in Seoul. She was carrying his child, and she had just heard him laugh about her like she was furniture. Zuri Bennett stood in the dark hallway outside Min Jae's private study, one hand pressed flat against the cold marble wall, the other trembling over her mouth to trap the scream building behind her teeth. Inside that room, the man she loved, the man whose ring sat heavy on her finger, was telling his lieutenant exactly what kind of woman he thought she was. Beautiful, loyal, completely blind. If you are watching this story right now, drop a like, comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow to the very end. Because what Zuri does next will change everything. The engagement party had ended 4 hours ago. The last of the caterers had gone, the florists had dismantled their elaborate arrangements from the grand foyer, and the Kong estate had finally exhaled into something resembling silence. Zuri had kicked off her heels near the bottom of the east staircase, carrying them in 2 fingers as she moved through the dim corridors on bare feet, the cool stone floor grounding her after 6 hours of smiling at people she barely knew, and pretending that every compliment about her future husband landed like warmth instead of weight. She had been heading toward the kitchen. That was all she had wanted, a glass of cold water, maybe some of the leftover rice from the staff dinner if she was lucky, and then sleep, real, horizontal, dreamless sleep in the enormous bed that still sometimes felt too large, too formal, too much like a stage set for a life she was still learning how to perform. She had not been looking for anything else. She was 3 steps past the closed door of Min Jae's private study when she heard it. Not raised voices, nothing dramatic. That was almost the worst part. She heard laughter, low, comfortable, the kind of laughter that belongs to men who have no reason to hide anything because they believe with absolute certainty that no one is listening. Min Jae's laughter was a sound she knew the way she knew her own heartbeat. She had spent 18 months memorizing it, cataloging its variations, learning the difference between the public version he deployed like a weapon at business dinners and the quieter, more private version she thought he reserved only for her. This version was neither. This was something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. She stopped walking. Her heels dangled from her fingers. The marble was cold under her feet. She stood there in the dark and told herself to keep moving. Told herself that whatever was being said inside that room was none of her business. Told herself that she was tired and pregnant and had earned the right to a glass of water and 8 hours of unconsciousness without adding new complications to her life. She stood there and she did not move. The announcement was perfect, she heard Min Jae say. His Korean was fluid and unhurried, the way it always was when he wasn't performing for a room. Her Korean had been strong enough for daily conversation since her 2nd year in Seoul, but in moments like this, low register, idiomatic, relaxed, she sometimes missed syllables. She didn't miss any now. Her brain sharpened itself against the words like a blade against stone. Better than I planned, honestly. She looked. A pause. A small sound of appreciation. Exactly right. She heard Park Sung-jin respond. Min Jae's lieutenant. A compact, watchful man who had never once in 18 months looked at her like she was a person. The guests were impressed, the Lim family specifically. Chairman Lim pulled me aside after. I know, he called me this morning. A sound of something being poured. Whiskey, probably. Min Jae always poured his own. Old man's been resistant to the acquisition for 2 years, but bring in the right optics, the right image. Another pause. A beautiful woman at your side changes the calculus. She's legitimate. She's educated. She's got her own business profile, which helps with the Western optics, and she photographs flawlessly. Silence. Zuri's hand found the wall, her palm pressed flat against it. The marble was cold and solid and real, and she needed that right now because the rest of the world was tilting slightly. She told herself she was misunderstanding, that she was tired, that she was filtering the conversation through the distorted lens of exhaustion and pregnancy hormones, and the residual anxiety that had been her constant companion since the engagement became official, and the full weight of what it meant to be connected to the Kang family had begun to settle on her shoulders. She told herself to walk away. Then Min Jae said, "She's beautiful, loyal, and completely blind. The perfect wife for appearances." The hallway didn't spin. The floor didn't move. Nothing in the physical world acknowledged what had just happened, and that absence of drama was somehow the most violent thing about it. The lights stayed dim. The air stayed still. Her own body stayed upright, one hand against the wall, heels dangling from two fingers, feet bare on cold stone. Her lungs stopped working for approximately 4 seconds. Then they started again. Slow, deliberate. She made them. She heard Park Sung-jin say something she couldn't catch, but his voice was lower, less distinct. And then Min-jae responded with something that contained Naomi's name, and that was when Zuri's hand clenched against the wall hard enough that her knuckles went white. Naomi Brooks, her best friend. The woman who had flown in from New York 6 weeks ago for the engagement, who had cried at the party tonight, who had hugged Zuri and said, "I'm so happy for you, Z. You deserve this. You finally have everything," with her face pressed into Zuri's shoulder and her voice breaking in a way that Zuri had interpreted as joy. Naomi, who Min-jae apparently had more to say about than Zuri had ever expected. She didn't catch everything. She caught enough. She caught careful, and she doesn't know. And keeping her close is useful, and she caught the specific sound of Min-jae's voice when he was satisfied with himself. That low, settled note of a man who believes he has arranged the world exactly as he intended. Zuri straightened up. She pulled her hand off the wall. She looked down at her heels dangling from her fingers, looked at them for a long, precise moment, and then she set them down carefully on the floor. She stepped into them. She adjusted her posture. She breathed out through her nose, slow and even. Then she walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, drank it standing at the counter in the dark, rinsed the glass, dried it, and put it back in the cabinet. And then she went upstairs to the bedroom she shared with Kang Min-jae, and she lay down on her side of the enormous staged bed, and she stared at the ceiling with dry eyes and a very quiet mind. She did not sleep. She thought. She had a meeting at 9 the next morning. Her company? Bennett Creative Solutions, the design and brand consultancy she had built from a 2-person operation in a Mapogu apartment into a firm with 12 employees and 3 significant corporate clients, did not stop requiring her attention simply because she was getting married. She had been determined about that from the beginning. Min-jae had offered, more than once, to absorb the business into the Kang Group's legitimate holdings, to give her a comfortable leadership title with no real responsibilities and a significant increase in resources. She had refused every time. She had refused politely. She had learned very quickly that with Min-jae, the manner of refusal mattered more than the refusal itself. Say no with friction, and you created a problem. Say no with warmth, with lightness, with an appeal to his ego. You know I need this. It's one of the things about me you love. And the no was accepted without consequence. She had gotten very good at the manner of refusal. She sat across from Ji-young now, her operations manager, in their glass-walled conference room, and she responded to questions about the Shin Electronics rebrand timeline with complete sentences that apparently made enough sense that Ji-young was writing things down and nodding. Zuri was present in every way that counted on paper. Her voice was steady. Her suggestions were coherent. She had not forgotten anything relevant. Inside, she was doing something else entirely. She was reconstructing the conversation from the hallway, turning it over, examining each piece for what she might have misunderstood, for alternate interpretations, for the possibility that her sleep-deprived first-trimester, stress-saturated mind had assembled something distorted out of innocent raw material. She gave herself that. She sat across from Ji-young in the glass conference room and gave herself the full benefit of every possible doubt. By the time the meeting ended, she had run out of alternate interpretations. The words had been what they were. The tone had been what it was. The name had been Naomi's. The satisfaction in Min-jae's voice had been exactly the satisfaction of a man who was not worried about getting caught because he had no reason to be. She gathered her papers. She said something pleasant to Ji-young. She walked to her private office, closed the door, sat down in her chair, and put her hands flat on her desk. The child inside her was 9 weeks along. She had told Min-jae 3 weeks ago. She had watched his face in that moment, genuinely watched it, the way she watched everything about him. The way she had trained herself to observe carefully because she had understood from early on that the version of Min-jae on display was not always the version underneath. And she had seen something real cross his expression, not performance, not calculation, something that looked like it mattered. She had been so sure of it. She pressed her palms flat on the desk and let the weight of being wrong about that settle through her completely, from her sternum to the floor of her stomach to the back of her throat, and she did not look away from it. Then she picked up her phone and called Kang Hyun-woo. She had met Min-jae's younger brother on her 3rd day in Seoul at a family dinner that had been staged rather than comfortable, all the warmth carefully arranged around a table that held two very different kinds of Kang men. Min-jae had been what she expected: magnetic, controlled, effortlessly commanding in the way of someone who had never in his adult life been in a room that he didn't run. Hyun-woo had been something she hadn't expected at all. He was quieter, not shy, not even close, but contained in a way that suggested the containment was a choice rather than a limitation. He asked her questions about her company that were specific enough to indicate he'd actually done some reading. He laughed once at something she said, and it was so sudden and unguarded that it seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. He had Min-jae's bone structure and none of Min-jae's performance. Over 18 months, they had built something she would have called a friendship, if the word hadn't felt slightly inadequate for what it actually was. Not romantic. Nothing that would have made Min-jae's jaw tighten if he'd known the specifics, but real, in the way that most of her relationships in Seoul were not. Hyun-woo had spent the last 4 years methodically disentangling himself from the Kang family business. Not dramatically, not in the explosive way Min-jae would have found threatening, but steadily, piece by piece, building a separate life in investment consulting that was clean and legitimate and entirely his own. He found the criminal empire his family had built morally compromising in ways he'd been honest about to Zuri, and she suspected to almost no one else. He answered on the second ring. "Zuri, I need to see you." She kept her voice level. She had gotten good at that. "Not at the estate, somewhere outside." A brief pause. "Are you okay?" "No." She considered that answer for a moment. "I mean, physically, I'm fine. The other kind." Another pause. Longer. She could hear him thinking. That was something she'd noticed about Hyun-woo in their first months of knowing each other. His silences were actual thought, not performance or strategy. He was working something out. "The cafe on Yeonam-dong, the one near the bookshop, can you be there at 1? "Yes?" "I'll be there." She put the phone down. She sat for another moment. Outside her office window, Seoul moved around its business in the January gray, all that city energy entirely indifferent to the specific shape of her disaster, and she found that indifference almost comforting. Nobody knew yet. Right now, it was only hers. She intended to use that. The cafe was small and warm, and smelled of roasted barley and something baked. Hyun-woo was already there when she arrived, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall and a cup of something steaming in front of him. And when she slid in across from him, he looked at her face, and his expression did something she recognized as the suppression of a strong reaction. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him with the same flat, even voice she'd been using all morning, organized and precise, without embellishment or additional emotion, because the facts themselves were sufficient, and she was not going to perform grief in a cafe in Yeonam-dong. She told him what she had heard in the hallway. She told him about the optics conversation, the acquisition strategy, the word blind. She told him about Naomi, the pieces she'd caught, the pieces she was fairly certain she understood even from fragments. Hyun-woo did not speak while she talked. He sat with both hands around his cup and he listened with his full attention, the kind of listening that involved his whole body going still. And when she finished, he continued to sit quietly for a moment that stretched long enough that she wondered if she'd made a mistake, if he would defend his brother, if the family loyalty would override everything else. "How long?" he said finally. Not a question exactly, more like he was asking himself. "I don't know." He looked at the window, the gray street, a woman pushing a stroller past the glass, hunched against the cold. "I've known for months that something was wrong," he said. He said it carefully, like a man who has been carrying a precise weight for a long time and is only now setting it down. "Not specifically. I didn't know—" He stopped. "Naomi, I didn't know. But the rest of it, the way he talked about you in certain rooms, the way he positioned the engagement, I kept telling myself I was wrong, that I was looking for problems." "You weren't wrong." "No." He looked at her. His eyes were Min-jae's eyes, the same dark, intense quality, but the thing behind them was different. Min-jae's gaze always moved like it was measuring something. Hyun-woo's was just looking. "What do you want to do?" The directness of the question hit her somewhere in the chest. Not "what are you going to do" or "what are you thinking?" What do you want? "I'm not leaving," she said, not quietly, not in a way that lets him manage the narrative, smooth it over, come out intact. She held his gaze. He put me in front of every person in his world and told them I was his. He used me as a prop in a machine he built. And now there's... She pressed one hand briefly to her stomach, a gesture she barely registered making. There's more than just me in this. Hyunwoo's expression shifted, just slightly. He knows, she said, about the pregnancy. He's known for 3 weeks. Hyunwoo put his cup down. And he didn't finish the sentence. Yes. The silence between them now had a different texture, denser. She watched him work through it, watched something in his face move from hurt to something colder and more purposeful. If you want to expose him, Hyunwoo said quietly, you're going to need more than what you heard in a hallway. He has lawyers. He has people who will call you unstable, emotional, fabricating. He'll use the pregnancy against you if he can, frame you as a woman making accusations out of desperation. He looked at her steadily. I have access to things you don't. Things I've been sitting on for reasons that seemed complicated before and seem much less complicated right now. Zuri went still. What kind of things? Messages, financial documentation, some recordings. He said the last word with a controlled precision that told her the recordings had weight. I've been building I didn't know what I was building it for. I told myself it was insurance, that I was being paranoid. His jaw tightened slightly. I wasn't being paranoid. She looked at him across the small table in the warm cafe, with the gray city moving past the window and the faint sound of something playing on a speaker near the counter, and she understood that she had just walked past a threshold. Behind her was the version of this situation where she still had choices about how much she was willing to do. Ahead of her was something with edges. We'd have to move carefully, she said. Yes, he can't know anything is different. I go back to the estate tonight, and I'm still the devoted fiancé. I smile. I eat dinner with him. I let him touch my hand and believe he's 6 feet ahead of everything. Something crossed Hyunwoo's face at that. Brief, quickly suppressed. I know. Can you do this? She meant it as a real question. He was asking her to help dismantle his own family. The family business that, even with his distance from it, was the water he'd grown up swimming in. I mean, actually do this. Not the logistics. This. He was quiet for a moment, then, he used you as furniture, Zuri. He made a child with you and then called you blind over whiskey. He met her eyes. Yes, I can do this. She nodded once. Then we need to talk about the wedding, she said. She drove back to the Sang estate in the early afternoon, parked in the underground garage she still thought of as Min Jae's and not hers, and sat in the car for 3 minutes with her hands on the wheel before she went inside. The estate was large in the way that announced itself. Not the largest thing in Seoul, not even close, given the circles the Kang family moved in, but large enough that she had taken 2 wrong turns in her first week here, large enough that the staff occupied an entirely separate section she had learned to avoid unless she needed something specific, large enough that 2 people could exist within its walls and genuinely not encounter each other for hours. She found Min Jae in the East Garden. He was on the phone, pacing the stone path between the ornamental trees with the specific energy of a man managing a crisis that he was, nonetheless, completely confident he would resolve. He glanced up when she came through the glass door, and his face did the thing she had learned to watch for: the brief assessment, the calibration, the decision about which version to deploy. He landed on warmth. He held up one finger and kept talking, but his free hand reached out as she passed and caught hers, squeezed it, let go. She squeezed back. Inside her chest, something that had not yet fully processed what she was doing turned over slowly like a stone. She sat in one of the garden chairs and waited for him to finish, watching his profile against the gray winter sky. He was a genuinely beautiful man. She had never been confused about that. Strong jaw, the kind of presence that suggested controlled force even in stillness, the ease of someone who had never had to work particularly hard to be the most compelling person in any given room. She had fallen into loving him with the specific, embarrassing completeness of a woman who had told herself for years that she was too smart to fall hard and fast, that she had too much sense, that she had watched enough other women lose themselves in the orbit of powerful men to know better. She had not known better. She knew better now. He ended the call and turned to her, and the warmth he manufactured for her was so convincingly assembled that for just a second, just one, she felt the pull of wanting it to be real. Rough morning? He said, sitting down beside her. Long meeting, she said. The Shin rebrand. Ji Young and I are pushing back the final presentation by a week. Smart. He reached over and brushed a thumb across her cheekbone, the gesture so practiced it came out as tenderness. You look tired. I am. She let herself lean into him slightly, just enough. 3 more days. He smiled, that slow, assured smile that she had mistaken for so long for something real. 3 more days. She held on to the smile she'd constructed and pressed it into the side of his shoulder and thought, I know exactly what you are. I know the whole shape of you now, and I am going to make sure that every person in that room sees it too. I can't wait, she said. The first piece of evidence arrived from Hyunwoo 2 days before the wedding, delivered via a secure messaging application she'd never heard of before their Yeonam Dong meeting and had since installed, learned, and deleted the installation history of. She was sitting in the dressing room of the bridal shop, a final fitting, her body still accommodating the baby in ways that required the alterations team to make 3 small adjustments to the waist, when the notification came through. She looked at it in the mirror while the seamstress worked at the hem, her expression serene and slightly distracted, the expression of a woman thinking about wedding logistics. The files were extensive, messages spanning 14 months. Not just the affair with Naomi, though those were there, explicit and functional and utterly without sentiment, the communications of 2 people conducting a transaction that they both understood in the same clinical terms. There were also business communications, conversations between Min Jae and Park Sung-jin about the strategic value of the marriage, the specific language about Western legitimacy, about optics, about the limb acquisition. There was a recording, 12 minutes, taken during what sounded like a late dinner in a private room somewhere, in which Min Jae described his approach to marriage with a directness that would have been almost impressive if it weren't aimed at her. She's not an asset I intend to invest in emotionally, he said, somewhere in the middle of the recording. She's infrastructure. Infrastructure. Zuri looked at herself in the mirror of the bridal shop, in the ivory gown that fit her body like a held breath, with the seamstress working at her hem and the soft sound of the boutique's music drifting through the dressing room door, and she held the word in her mind. Infrastructure. She thought about the child inside her. 9 weeks, now 11. The size, she'd read somewhere, of a lime. She thought about the night she'd told Min Jae, his face, the thing she'd seen move across it and decided was real. She looked at herself in the mirror, and she made herself a specific promise. Every single person in that ceremony would hear that word, not from her. They would hear it in his own voice. It looks beautiful, the seamstress said, stepping back. It does, Zuri said. She turned slowly on the low platform, looking at the gown from every angle. She looked like exactly what Min Jae had selected her to look like. It looks perfect. The night before the wedding, she lay in the bed beside him in the dark and listened to his breathing slow into sleep. He was out within 12 minutes. He had always been a reliable sleeper. One of those people whose conscience, or whatever served as its equivalent, offered no resistance to unconsciousness. She envied it in a distant, abstract way. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and went through everything in her head, start to finish. Not the emotional architecture of it. Not what it felt like to be here. Not the grief that moved through her in waves she could no longer really distinguish from nausea. Not the part of her that was still, even now, stupidly in love with the version of him she had invented. She put all of that somewhere she could access later, and she went through the plan. Hyunwoo had arranged the technical side. A colleague, someone vetted and trusted entirely outside the King network, who could handle the audio-visual integration in the ceremony space during the preceding night. The files were organized. The sequence was built. The screen behind the altar was a standard feature of the venue. The signal override had been confirmed as feasible. She would have to hold the floor long enough for it to play. She would have to stand at that altar, in front of every powerful person Min Jae had invited to witness his triumph. And she would have to hold her ground while the room turned and while he looked at her and while she felt the full force of what she was doing. She had been running calculations on her emotional reserves since the hallway. She was not sure she had enough. She was going to have to find enough. Beside her, Min Jae made a small sound in his sleep and shifted, and his hand moved across the sheet and landed near hers, not touching, just adjacent, the way they always ended up by morning. She looked at his hand in the dark, the length of the fingers, the small scar on the knuckle of his right hand from something he'd never told her about. She thought, I would have loved you so completely. You would have had everything you wanted from me, and you would have had it freely, without management, without architecture. You had no idea what you were throwing away. The grief came then. Briefly, fully, like cold water. She let it move through her. Then she closed her eyes, and she thought about her daughter. The daughter she had somehow decided it already was. Without evidence, without reason, just a certainty that settled in the way these things sometimes do. And she thought about the kind of world she intended to bring her into. Not this one. Not the world where the man sleeping beside her operated. Something better. Something she would have to build herself. She had been building things herself for a long time. She was not afraid of the work. The last thought she had before sleep took her, somewhere in the small hours of the morning before her wedding day, was not about Min-jae at all. It was about the way Hyun-woo had said, "What do you want?" The directness of it. The clean respect of treating her like a person who was entitled to want things and to act on them. She fell asleep thinking about what it would feel like to be treated that way by someone who meant it. She woke at 5:30 to gray light through the curtains, and Min-jae already gone from the bed, his morning run, his routine unbroken by the significance of the day, and the Kong estate staff beginning their quiet preparations in the rooms below. She lay still for 60 seconds. Then she got up, went to the window, and looked out at Seoul, waking under a winter sky the color of unpolished silver. Today was her wedding day. She pressed one hand to her stomach. "Okay," she said softly. To nobody, to the city, to the child that was the size of a lime and did not yet know what kind of mother it had. "Let's go." She reached for her phone and sent Hyun-woo a single word. "Ready." His response came back in under a minute. "So am I." She put the phone down and went to get dressed. 3 floors below, in the main hall of the Kang estate, the preparations for the most carefully constructed destruction of a man's empire were already underway. The florists had arrived. The cars were being arranged. The catering staff were moving through their choreography with the cheerful, purposeful efficiency of people who had no idea that the event they were preparing was not going to end the way anyone expected. Zuri stood at the window and felt the day settling over her like armor. Somewhere in this enormous house, Kang Min-jae was finishing his morning run and preparing to dress for his wedding. Preparing for his triumph. Preparing to stand at an altar in front of every ally, every enemy, every ambitious associate he had ever cultivated, and secure his position with the most valuable kind of currency a man in his position could acquire. The appearance of legitimacy. The image of a man who could be trusted. Because look at what he had chosen. Look at the woman who chose him back. He had no idea. And in the entire calculation he had built his future on, that was the only variable he had never thought to account for. The woman he thought was blind had been watching him. She had been watching him the whole time. The cars left the Kang estate at 9:15, 3 black vehicles moving in the specific formation that Min-jae's security team had drilled into their bones. Lead car, principal car, trailing car. Through streets that Seoul had not yet surrendered to the kind of cold that made movement feel punishing. January had been merciful this year, or at least that was what people kept saying at the estate, making conversation about the weather because the alternative was acknowledging the specific electrical charge that had been building in every room since sunrise. Zuri sat in the principal car and watched the city go past the tinted window and kept her breathing even. Min-jae was beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the sleeve of his morning suit. He was on his phone. He had been on his phone since he came downstairs, the day operating around him like a machine he was running from a distance, because that was who he was. A man who could get married and manage 3 business crises simultaneously and consider both things equally unremarkable. He had told her she looked breathtaking. He had said it the way he said most things to her, with the exact right tone, the exact right weight, the exact right duration of eye contact. She had said thank you and touched his jaw and watched his eyes do the small, satisfied thing they did when she performed correctly. She was very tired of performing correctly. But she had 3 more hours of it, maybe 4. She was not going to lose 3 months of careful, grinding endurance in the back of a car because she was tired. She looked at the city. She breathed. She thought about Hyun-woo's single-word response from this morning. Ready? And she let it sit in the center of her chest like a coal. Min-jae ended his call. Sungjin says the florist finished the altar arrangement at 7, he said, without looking up from whatever he was typing. Apparently they argued about the white roses for 40 minutes. Were they worth arguing about? Everything worth having is worth arguing about. He put the phone in his inside pocket and turned to look at her, and the look was warm and specific and completely constructed. "You nervous?" "A little," she said. Honest for once. He smiled. "Don't be. You've done everything right." She held his gaze. "So have you," she said. What? The venue was a converted historic hall in Jongno-gu that the Kong family had been using for significant events for 2 decades. Not a traditional ceremony space, but Min-jae had made that clear from the beginning, which had suited Zuri fine because the traditional options had felt too loaded with symbolism she wasn't sure she could stomach. The hall had high ceilings, long windows that let in the flat winter light, and a stage at the far end that had been dressed with an extravagance that bordered on architectural. The screen was already in place. It had always been in place, a permanent feature of the hall's event setup, used for presentations, slideshows, the family photographs that typically played during receptions. Nobody would look at it and think anything other than standard venue equipment. Zuri walked through the side entrance with Min-jae's hand at her back, and she did not look at the screen. The bridal suite was a converted antechamber off the main corridor, hung with ivory fabric and smelling of the white flowers someone had arranged on every available surface. Naomi was already there. Zuri had been preparing for this moment since the night in the hallway. She had rehearsed it the same way she'd rehearsed everything else in the last 3 days, with the cold, specific attention of a person who could not afford to be surprised by their own reactions. She had worked through what it would feel like to walk into a room and find Naomi's face waiting for her. All that warmth and familiarity and history, and she had decided in advance exactly how much of what she felt she was going to show. None of it. Naomi looked up when she came in, and her face did the thing it had been doing for 6 weeks. That particular quality of gladness, the rush of warmth that Zuri now understood was layered over something else entirely, something with guilt running beneath it like a cold current under ice. Z. Naomi crossed the room and hugged her, and her arms were as familiar as they had always been, the exact shape of a friendship that went back 11 years. And Zuri hugged her back with her eyes open and her mind entirely clear. "You look incredible," Naomi said, pulling back to look at her. Her own eyes were bright. "I mean, Zuri, come on." "Stop," Zuri said. She laughed lightly. "You're going to make me cry, and I cannot cry in this makeup." Naomi laughed too. It was a real laugh. That was the thing that continued to be strangest. Naomi's emotions, as far as Zuri could tell, were real. The guilt was real. The affection was real. The gladness was real. She had somehow constructed a version of events in which all these things could coexist without contradiction. And she had been living inside it comfortably enough to stand here in the bridal suite and look at Zuri with genuine love. Zuri had spent a long time being angry about a lot of things in the last 72 hours. This particular version of the anger was the one she found hardest to set aside. "Thank you for being here," she said. Naomi squeezed her hands. "There's nowhere else I'd be." Wow. The guests arrived between 10 and 11. Zuri could hear the accumulating sound of them from the bridal suite. Not individual voices, but the collective hum of a large number of powerful people gathering in an enclosed space. The specific social energy of an event that was, for most of them, not primarily a celebration, but a piece of business conducted in a festive register. She sat at the vanity while the makeup artist made small adjustments she didn't need, and watched herself in the mirror and listened to that hum grow. There were people in that room whose names she knew from Min-jae's business files, which she had read thoroughly over the preceding 18 months, because she was not, whatever he believed, blind. There were politicians whose campaigns the Kang family had financed through channels that existed at an angle to the law. There were business executives whose cooperation Min-jae had secured through a combination of incentive and pressure that varied case by case. There were foreign nationals she knew almost nothing about, except that their presence at the wedding would have been, in Min-jae's careful accounting, worth more than most of the Korean guests combined. They were all here to watch him win. She thought about that. She sat very still while the makeup artist worked at her hairline, and she thought about what it meant that Min-jae had assembled this specific crowd for this specific occasion, and what it would mean for each of them when the occasion stopped being the thing they'd anticipated. Some would be angry at her. She had accepted that. Some proportion of the room would leave the hall today having decided that she was the problem, that she was unstable or destructive or pursuing some agenda of her own. Min-jae would work that angle immediately and work it hard. She could not control the story he would try to tell afterward. What she could control was what happened in the room before the afterward began. Her phone buzzed once against the surface of the vanity. She picked it up without looking like she was doing anything urgent. A message from an unknown number, which was Hyun Woo's second phone. "Everything is set. He's at the altar. Take your time." She put the phone down. She met her own eyes in the mirror. The makeup artist stepped back. "All done." "Perfect," Zuri said. "Thank you," Zuri said. She stood up. She smoothed the ivory gown over her hips. She picked up the small bouquet of white flowers that someone had left on the vanity table and held it in both hands and let the stems press into her palms. Behind her, Naomi said, "It's time." "I know," Zuri said. She took one breath. All the way in, all the way out, slow and deliberate, the breath of a person choosing to do a hard thing and choosing it completely. "Let's go," she said. "Passe." The walk down the corridor toward the main hall was 23 steps. She counted them. Beside her, Naomi moved with the practiced ease of a woman who had been a maid of honor before and knew the choreography. She held herself correctly. She smiled at the two guests they passed in the corridor. She was doing everything right. 23 steps. At the end of them, a set of tall doors stood closed, and beyond those doors was the accumulated weight of every choice Zuri had made in the last 3 days, in the last 3 months, in the last 18 months leading toward this single point. And she stood in front of those doors and felt the full mass of it. The doors opened. The room was everything she'd expected and somehow more. The scale of it, the long space filled with people, every seat taken, the flat winter light coming through the high windows and falling across 200 faces that all turned toward her at the same moment. The altar at the far end dressed in white and silver. The screen behind it, dark and inactive, enormous and waiting. And Min-jae, standing at the altar with the ease of a man who has never once in his life doubted that a room was his. Dressed perfectly, of course. He was always dressed perfectly, with that particular quality of contained force that photographs never quite captured, but that a room could feel the moment he walked into it. He was looking at her down the full length of the aisle with an expression she had spent 18 months interpreting as love. She started walking, one step, then another. The music was something orchestral that she'd agreed to months ago without caring much about it. The faces on either side of the aisle registered in her peripheral vision as a kind of blur, specific individuals resolving briefly and then receding. She saw Min-jae's father near the front, the aging patriarch, white-haired and still powerful, his face arranged into the ceremonial approval of a man attending the formalization of a transaction he had already approved. She saw Park Sung-jin 3 rows back, standing rather than sitting, because he was working even here. His eyes moved across the room in the continuous assessment of a man paid to notice threats, and they settled on her for a moment with that specific blankness she had always disliked. She walked. Min-jae's face was doing the warmth. He was very good at it. As she came closer, she could see the specific satisfaction beneath the warmth, the quiet, settled triumph of a man arriving at the end of a plan that had gone exactly as intended. He reached out when she was close enough, and she put her hand in his, and he squeezed it, and she squeezed back. "You look extraordinary," he said quietly. "You look happy," she said. "I am." She held his eyes and thought, 11 more minutes. Lucky. The officiant was a colleague of Min-jae's. Not a professional, just a man with legal standing to perform the ceremony who owed Min-jae something. He had the voice for it, at least. Measured, resonant, the cadence of a man who understood that he was performing rather than presiding. He spoke about partnership, about the particular courage of choosing another person, about trust. Zuri stood at the altar and let the words go past her and watched Min-jae's face. He was not thinking about what the officiant was saying. She could tell. His attention was moving through the room behind her, assessing, accounting, cataloging returns on investment. He was doing, in real time, exactly what she had always suspected he was doing at every formal occasion, running the numbers while the performance ran itself. He glanced at her and found her watching him and produced the warm smile immediately, automatic as breathing. She smiled back. The officiant worked through his preamble. The ring exchange was approaching, then the vows, then the question. She felt Hyun-woo before she saw him, a settling in the room's energy from the far left side, a small atmospheric change that she recognized because she had been attuned to it for days. He was there. He was in position. He had come in late, as planned, and he was standing near the audiovisual panel at the side wall, and everything that needed to be ready was ready. She thought about what she was about to do, not regret. She had worked through regret so thoroughly that the ground was bare, but the full weight of it, held consciously rather than avoided. She was about to detonate something in a room full of people, some of whom were innocent of anything except proximity, and the detonation would not be clean and it would not be surgical, and there would be collateral in the form of a public humiliation so complete that nothing about Min Jae's life was going to look the same afterward. He had made her into infrastructure. He had made their child into leverage. He had taken Naomi, the person Zuri had trusted more than almost anyone in her adult life, and made her into a transaction. She was going to give him exactly the public spectacle he'd always been so careful to control. The officiant said, "If anyone present has reason to object to this union, let them speak now." It was a traditional line, a formality. Nobody in this room was going to object. Everyone in this room was here because they had been carefully selected by a man who did not allow surprises. Zuri raised her hand, not high, just enough. Just the clear, deliberate gesture of a person indicating they had something to say. The room registered it in a wave. A ripple of turning heads, exchanged glances. The ambient murmur of 200 people recalibrating simultaneously. Min Jae's face did something she had never seen it do. It went briefly, genuinely still. Not the controlled stillness he deployed like a tool. Actual stillness. The stillness of a system encountering an input it had no category for. "Zuri," he said, quiet. The warning frequency of a man who was still certain he was going to resolve this in the next 30 seconds. She did not look at him. She looked at the screen. Hyun Woo hit the signal. The screen behind the altar came to life. The first thing that appeared was a photograph. Min Jae and Naomi, in what appeared to be a hotel corridor. His hand at her waist, her face turned up toward his, the specific body language of two people who were not concerned about being observed because they believed they were alone. The timestamp in the corner said October, 3 months after he and Zuri had made the pregnancy announcement public. The sound that moved through the room was not a gasp. It was more complicated than that. It was the sound of 200 people simultaneously processing a revision to their understanding of events, each of them doing the math at different speeds. Min Jae turned. He saw the screen. She watched his face do the thing she had been waiting for. Not the immediate calculation she'd expected, but something that came before it. Something raw and brief, a genuine crack in the architecture of his expression, before the professional machinery kicked back in and began assessing damage. "Turn it off," he said. He said it to Park Sung-jin, low and immediate, without raising his voice. Still managing, still running the play. Park Sung-jin moved. He was already moving, but before he could reach the panel, the second file loaded. Text messages. On the screen, enlarged to a size that the back row could read without effort. Min Jae's name at the top of the thread. Naomi's number. The content clinical and specific. The communications of two people conducting an arrangement they both understood in exactly the same terms. Then the financial documentation. Partnership restructuring. The limb acquisition. Min Jae's own words in his own writing, describing Zuri's value to the Kong Group's public legitimacy in language he had apparently never imagined would leave the private server he kept it on. Then the audio began. "She's not an asset I intend to invest in emotionally." His voice, unmistakably his, the same voice that had said "you look extraordinary" 4 minutes ago. "She's infrastructure." The room had gone very quiet. It was not the quiet of shock, or not only that, it was the specific quiet of a room full of people who had all, simultaneously, registered that the ground they were standing on was not the ground they had been told it was. The politicians were doing political calculations. The business associates were doing business calculations. The criminal network representatives were doing whatever their equivalent was, and it was almost certainly colder than either. Min Jae's father had not moved. At the side of the room, Naomi had gone the color of old paper. Min Jae turned from the screen and looked at Zuri. And there it was. Finally, genuinely, without the warmth or the performance or the careful manufacture, the real thing. The actual face of Kang Min Jae, stripped of its management, confronted with the one variable his entire architecture had failed to account for. It wasn't rage. That was the thing that surprised her. It wasn't even cold. It was something more honest than either. The expression of a man who had built a world on the assumption of other people's limitations and was only now, in this moment, understanding that he had miscalculated. "You," he said. Not even the rest of the sentence. Just that. Me, Zuri said. She kept her voice level. She kept her body still. She looked at him across the altar in the quiet room with the screen playing behind them, and she held his gaze and did not move first. His jaw tightened. He watched the calculation return to his eyes. She could see the moment it happened, the moment the raw thing was covered back over and the strategic mind re-engaged, assessing how much of this was recoverable, what play was still available, how fast he could move to shift the narrative, and who in this room he still had enough grip on to work with. "This is fabricated," he said. He said it to the room. He said it with conviction, the conviction of a man who had walked out of worse situations by simply refusing to accept the terms being offered. Someone is trying to destroy this family. I don't know who put her up to this. Your voice is on the recording, Zuri said. Audio can be manufactured. Your messages are on the screen. Screenshots can be... The financial documentation, she said, came from your own server. The one your IT team backed up to the secondary system in the Gangnam office. Your brother has the access logs. Min-jae stopped. The word brother landed in the room like a stone into still water. He turned. And Hyun-woo, who had been standing at the side of the room with his hands quiet at his sides, and his face carrying the specific expression of a man who has carried a weight for a very long time and has finally set it down, looked back at him. The silence between the brothers lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Zuri watched Min-jae understand the full shape of what had happened to him. Not just who had helped, not just how the evidence had been assembled, but the deeper thing. That the person he had trusted most completely in the architecture of his personal world, the one relationship he had believed was beyond the reach of his own behavior, had been the instrument of his exposure. Min-jae's face went somewhere she had no word for. Hyun-woo, he said. Just the name. Barely sound. Hyun-woo said nothing, and in that silence, in front of the accumulated power of everything Min-jae had built and everyone he had used to build it, Zuri pressed one hand to her stomach and said, I'm pregnant. The child is yours. And I'm not going to raise her in a house built on lies. The word landed in the room and the room held it. 200 people, not one of them breathing at full capacity, all of them suspended in the specific stillness of witnesses who understand they are watching something that cannot be taken back. The screen behind the altar was still running. The audio had looped back to the beginning. She's not an asset I intend to invest in emotionally. And Min-jae's voice filled the hall with the patient, measured tone of a man who had believed he was speaking in permanent privacy. Zuri stood with her hand over her stomach and her bouquet hanging loose at her side, and she looked at the room rather than at Min-jae, because she had finished looking at Min-jae, and what she needed now was to see the effect, to know whether it had been enough, to read 200 faces for the specific shift that meant the structure was coming down. What she saw was not what she had planned for. The effect was there, undeniably, visibly there, written across the front rows in expressions that ranged from rigid discomfort to barely contained disgust. Chairman Lim had turned to the man beside him and was saying something low and rapid. 3 of the foreign nationals in the 4th row were already consulting with each other in a language she couldn't place, their body language brisk and conclusive, the body language of people closing a door. Min-jae's father had not moved from his chair. He sat with both hands on his knees, and his face arranged into something that was not grief and not rage and not shame, but all 3 pressed together into a stillness that was somehow worse than any of them separately. But something was wrong. She felt it before she understood it, the way you feel weather changing before the sky shows you why. A current in the room that was moving in a direction she hadn't accounted for. She turned, tracking it, looking for the source. Park Sung-jin was no longer standing 3 rows back. She looked for him instinctively, the way she had trained herself to track him over 18 months of understanding that his position in any room indicated the direction of Min-jae's actual attention. He was not at the back. He was not at the side wall. She swept the room and could not find him, and the back of her neck went cold. Then her phone, tucked flat against her left side beneath the structured fabric of the gown, in the small interior pocket she had specifically requested from the seamstress, vibrated once, hard. The single pulse pattern she and Hyun-woo had agreed meant something had gone wrong. She did not look at Hyun-woo. She did not change her face. Min-jae was still talking. He had found his register. Not defensive anymore, not the raw cracked thing from 30 seconds ago, but the voice he used in boardrooms when a negotiation turned against him and he needed to reset the terms. Controlled, authoritative. The voice that assumed its own legitimacy. He was talking about fabrication, about coordinated attacks on his family's reputation, about the particular vulnerability of public figures to this kind of malicious campaign. Some people were listening. Not the majority, but some. And in a room this specifically assembled, some was sufficient to create doubt. And doubt was Min Jae's primary working material. She had known this. She had accounted for it. The evidence was meant to be too comprehensive, too specific, too clearly in his own voice and his own hand to be reasonably questioned. She had not accounted for Park Sung-jin being gone. Hyun-woo appeared at her left shoulder. He had crossed the room without appearing to hurry, the specific skill of a man who had spent years learning how not to be noticed in rooms he was technically part of. He leaned close enough that his words reached only her. "Sung-jin left," he said, 2 minutes ago, before the audio started. Before he knew. Hyun-woo's voice was completely flat. He was already moving when you raised your hand. Zuri felt the floor of something drop out beneath her before she raised her hand, which meant before the screen came on, which meant before any of the evidence was visible. Park Sung-jin had started leaving the room before the exposure began, which meant he had known what was coming, which meant, "The second server," she said. Hyun-woo's jaw tightened microscopic, but she was watching for it. "The access logs, someone else pulled them before I did. Someone went through the same files and found the same documentation and told him," Zuri said. Not a question. The calculation assembled itself in her mind with a cold, rapid precision that felt like something physical, like ice water moving through her circulatory system, reaching all the way to her extremities. If Sung-jin had known what was on those servers before today, if he had briefed Min Jae before today, if Min Jae had come to the ceremony already knowing what was coming, she looked at Min Jae. He was still talking to the room, still working the crowd, but his eyes moved to her for just a half second, and in that half second she saw something that rewrote the last 3 days completely. He had known, not everything. He hadn't been certain. If he'd been certain, he would have moved before the ceremony, would have found a way to neutralize the evidence before it reached a public venue. But he had been warned. He had known there was a possibility, which was why he hadn't tried to stop the screen in the moment, why he had let it play for 30 full seconds before beginning his denial. He had been watching the room, reading the damage, calculating whether to fight it or pivot through it. He had been running his own play the whole time. "Zuri," Hyun-woo's voice. Not urgent, he didn't do urgent, but carrying something compressed and tight. "There's something else." She looked at him. His face, which had been steady throughout every part of the last 3 days, was doing something she had not seen it do before. A look that combined the controlled expression of a man who is going to say something difficult with the specific bracing quality of someone who is uncertain how the thing they are about to say will land. "What?" she said. "The files I pulled from the secondary server." He paused. The pause was unlike him. "There were files I didn't show you." The room's noise receded. Not literally. 200 people were still generating the collective hum of a crowd in crisis, Min Jae's voice still moving through it, the screen still running its loop behind the altar. But in the small space between Zuri and Hyun-woo, everything went very quiet. "Tell me," she said. "Not here." His hand moved to her elbow, light. Not guiding, just indicating. "We need to... Tell me here." She looked at him steadily. Her voice did not waver. "Right now." Hyun-woo looked at her face, and whatever he found there made him abandon the idea of postponing it. "There are communications," he said quietly, "between Min Jae and your business partners. Shin Electronics, the Mapogu investors, your 3 primary clients." He held her eyes. "He's been maintaining those relationships, not supporting them, managing them. There are messages going back 14 months in which he is explicitly responsible for keeping those contracts active. He's been feeding information to your competitors, creating small problems that he then quietly resolved, making himself necessary to the stability of your business without you knowing he was involved." Zuri did not speak. "Bennett Creative Solutions," Hyun-woo said, and his voice was careful and precise in the way of someone delivering a medical diagnosis, "has been operating inside a structure that he built and maintained. If that structure is removed..." He stopped. "My company goes with it," she said. Not a question. "It would require rebuilding from close to zero. The clients would need to be reapproached without his backing. Some of them..." He paused again. "Some of them may not have engaged with your firm on the merits alone." The specific silence that followed was different from anything that had preceded it. Zuri had planned for many things. She had planned for Min Jae's denial, for the room's mixed reactions. for the legal exposure, for the public narrative battle, for the financial complications of an engagement dissolution under Korean civil code. She had planned for the pregnancy, for the immediate period of vulnerability, for the shape of a life that would need to be substantially rebuilt. She had not planned for the thing she had believed was entirely hers to have been something else entirely, her company. The one thing that had never been about Min-jae, that had been her proof to herself that she existed independently of the relationship, that she was not, she had always been so certain of this, she was not one of those women who lost themselves in a powerful man's orbit. She had her own orbit. She had built it herself, from the ground up, with her own intelligence and her own work and her own 14 months. He had been inside it for 14 months. She felt the grief of it differently than the other grief. The betrayal of the relationship had been devastating, but it had a shape she could work with. It was personal. It was intimate. It was the category of loss that people survived by moving through it and out the other side. This was different. This was the thing she had always understood herself to be. The core identity she had never allowed to be contingent on anyone else. And he had been quietly making himself its foundation without her knowledge. And now it was Zuri. Hyunwoo said her name with the specific care of someone trying to reach a person they can see going underwater. She blinked. Min-jae had stopped talking. She became aware of the room again, of the fact that 200 people were watching her, that Min-jae had stopped his denial and was looking at her with an expression she had not yet categorized, and that the dynamic of the room had shifted in the last 90 seconds in a way she had not fully tracked because she had been inside the conversation with Hyunwoo and not monitoring the larger space. Min-jae looked at his brother, then at her. "She came to you," he said. He said it with a kind of tired clarity, the voice of a man putting down something heavy. "How long?" Hyunwoo said nothing. "How long?" Min-jae said again. He was not asking for information. She understood that. He was performing the question for the room, framing the narrative, giving the crowd a story where the wound was his, where he was the one who had been betrayed, where the brother and the fiancé had conspired against a man who had loved and trusted them. And wasn't that the real story? Wasn't that the thing everyone should be looking at? She understood what he was doing, and she watched approximately a third of the room start to feel it. "Don't," she said. Min-jae looked at her. "Don't what?" "Make yourself the victim, not in front of these people." She held his gaze. "Not today. You staged an ambush at my wedding. You staged a wedding to launder your reputation. She stopped, corrected. "I showed people what was already there, with my brother's help." His voice was flat now, all the warmth stripped, nothing left but the actual instrument of the man. "My own family." "You used me as infrastructure," she said. The word had been waiting in her mouth for 2 days. "Your word, your voice, the recording." She tilted her head slightly toward the screen. Infrastructure. Something moved across Min-jae's face, the briefest of something, quickly suppressed. "You made a child with me," she said, and then had that conversation. "You don't know the full—" "I know enough." She was calm. It was the calm of a person who is operating past the boundary of what they thought they could endure and has discovered, on the other side of it, that something simpler takes over. "I know that you knew what I was planning this morning. I know Sungjin told you. I know you came here anyway." Min-jae's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Why?" she said. "If you knew, why come?" And there it was, the pause before the answer that told her more than the answer would. He had come because he had believed, even knowing what she was carrying into this room, that he could still win. That the room was his, that the relationships were his, that the weight of his name and his network and his specific practiced authority would be sufficient to absorb whatever she brought against him and come out the other side intact. He had come because he did not believe she was capable of this, even at the last moment, even warned. He had not believed it. "You thought I'd lose my nerve," she said. He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. She could see it in the slight adjustment of his posture, the micro-expression that crossed his face and was gone before most people in the room would have registered it. "Infrastructure," she said again, quietly, and turned away from him. Park Sungjin came back into the room through the side door. He came in moving fast, and he crossed directly to Min-jae with the compressed urgency of a man carrying news that cannot wait. He reached Min-jae and put his mouth close to his ear, and Zuri watched Min-jae's face receive whatever was being said. What she saw happen to Min Jae's face then was something she had never seen before and did not fully understand. Not anger, not calculation. Something that preceded both of those. Something that reached back before the professional architecture to whatever lived underneath it and disturbed it. Min Jae straightened. He looked at Sung Jin. He said one word in Korean that she caught, but that didn't make immediate sense in context. When? Sung Jin answered with a number. Min Jae looked at Hyun Woo. Hyun Woo was already still, but he went stiller. The Busan operation, Min Jae said. His voice was different now. All the performance gone. All the warmth and the calculation and the narrative management stripped away. This was something underneath all of that, the voice of a man speaking at frequency 0. Someone accessed the Busan accounts this morning. He looked at Hyun Woo with an expression that had nothing resembling brotherly anything in it. 40 minutes ago. Zuri looked at Hyun Woo, and Hyun Woo, steady, contained, the most controlled person she had encountered in 18 months of carefully observing people who lived behind their faces, did something she had not seen him do in all that time. He looked away. The room felt it. Even the people who didn't understand the Busan reference, even the guests who had been following the emotional arc of the preceding 20 minutes without the business context to decode the technical layers, they felt the specific quality of that look. The way it answered the accusation before the accusation was fully formed. Zuri's mouth opened. She did not speak because she did not yet have the words, because the revision was too large, because she was standing at an altar in an ivory gown with a bouquet hanging from her hand, and her stomach was a wall of nausea that was not pregnancy, and the room was very loud suddenly, very loud, all those suppressed reactions finding their release at once as 200 people registered that the story had just changed shape again. Hyun Woo, she said his name. He looked at her. His face was the face she knew, careful, real, the face of a man she had trusted with everything in the last 72 hours. But there was something behind it now that she was only seeing because she was looking with different eyes. The Busan accounts, Min Jae said, his voice carrying across the noise of the room without effort. The family reserve. The accounts that exist outside every legal structure we have. He looked at Zuri and then back at his brother. Emptied. This morning, while everyone was watching the ceremony. Zuri looked at Hyun Woo and said, very quietly, so that only he could hear it, "Tell me that isn't what he's saying it is." Hyun Woo held her eyes. "Tell me," she said, "that you didn't use me." The silence that followed was 4 seconds long and contained the specific quality of a world ending quietly. And then Hyun Woo said, in a voice that was almost gentle, in the voice of a man who has rehearsed this and found no version of it that doesn't land well. The sentence didn't finish. It didn't need to. Zuri heard the rest of it in the silence that followed, in the specific quality of Hyun Woo's stillness, in the way he held her eyes without flinching, without apology, without the desperate scramble of a man who had been caught doing something he was ashamed of. He was not ashamed. That was the thing that moved through her like a blade. He was not ashamed. He was resigned, and there was a difference, and she understood it immediately and completely. He had known this moment was coming. He had prepared for it. She had handed him everything he needed to prepare. The room was in full noise now. The controlled event space quiet of the preceding 20 minutes had fractured completely, and 200 people were no longer pretending to observe. They were reacting, talking, moving, the specific kinetic energy of a crowd that has watched one detonation and just registered that there is a second. Chairs scraped. Voices overlapped. Near the entrance, she could see 2 of the foreign nationals already standing, already reaching for phones, already in the process of removing themselves from an event that had stopped being useful. She did not watch them leave. She watched Hyun Woo. "How much?" she said. He didn't ask her to clarify. "Everything in the reserve accounts," he said. 14 million, USD equivalent. Her stomach moved. Not nausea. Something more animal than that. The specific physical response of a body understanding, before the mind has finished processing, that the scale of what has happened is larger than the scale she had been operating inside. "You needed access to the servers," she said. Her voice sounded very far away from her. "You needed someone who could get you close to Min Jae's network without triggering his security. Someone he would never surveil because he thought he had total control over." "Yes," Hyun Woo said. One word, clean, no deflection. "I was the reason he didn't look," she said. "He was watching me. His security was watching me. And you moved through everything while everyone was pointed in my direction. Yes. She hit him. Not a slap. She had never in her adult life slapped someone. It was too theatrical, too much like something from a different register of emotion than the one she operated in. She hit him with a closed fist, short and hard, directly in the sternum, and his breath came out in a sharp exhale, and he stepped back once and did not raise his hands. You used me, she said. Her voice was not a whisper, and it was not a shout. It was the voice that lived between those things, the voice that comes from a place below the throat. You let me believe you were. You let me trust you with everything, with the plan, with the timing, with where I would be standing and what I would be doing while you. I know. Don't say I know. Her hand was shaking. She looked at it. She made it stop. Tell me one thing. The evidence. The recordings, the messages. Was any of it manufactured? No. His eyes were steady. She hated that they were steady. Everything on that screen is real. Every word is his. Every message is his. I didn't fabricate a single piece of it. But you were always going to use the exposure as cover. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment, with the room exploding around them, and Min Jae not 15 feet away, and 200 witnesses in various stages of departure or paralysis, and she made herself look at Hyun Woo's face and ask the thing she needed answered above everything else. The baby, she said, did that factor into your calculation at all? Something moved in his face, finally. The first crack in the composure, small and real. Zuri, answer the question. It's why I didn't tell you. His voice dropped. If you had known what I was doing, I would have stopped you. Yes. So you made the decision for me. She held his eyes. You decided I didn't get to know. You decided that what I wanted was less important than what you needed. He didn't answer. The answer was in the silence. You're just like him, she said. Hyun Woo's jaw tightened. For the first time, something in his expression resisted. A flicker of something that wanted to argue, that had a counter-argument, that believed the comparison was unjust. She watched him hold it back. She watched him choose not to make it. That choice, at least, was different from his brother. It didn't make her less furious. She turned. Min Jae was 6 feet away. He had moved while she was talking to Hyun Woo, closing the distance without announcing it, and he was standing now in the space between the altar and the first row with Park Sung-jin at his right shoulder, and his face carrying an expression she had never seen on him in 18 months. Not rage. She had seen echoes of his rage before, in the way he handled business confrontations, in the cold efficiency he deployed when someone violated an agreement. Not satisfaction. There was nothing here to be satisfied about. What she was looking at was something rawer than either of those. Min Jae stripped of everything he performed, standing in the wreckage of his own event, and for the first time actually, fully, looking at her. He used you, Min Jae said. My own brother. He said it like he was testing the shape of the words. You came here to destroy me, and he used you to rob me. How does that sit? Don't, she said. I'm not gloating. And he wasn't. That was the strange and disorienting thing. His voice had no gloat in it. I'm asking, woman to man, how does it feel to have been played by both of us? The cruelty of the question was that it was a real question. He actually wanted to know. He was not, in this moment, performing anything. He was standing in front of her with his empire in fragments, and his family reserve emptied, and his name being discussed in furious whispers by every powerful person he'd ever cultivated. And he was asking her how she felt with the specific curiosity of a man who had never once in his life been able to understand why human beings were the way they were. She almost answered him honestly. She came very close. The difference, she said instead, is that I'm still standing here. I'm not running. Min Jae looked at her. Neither am I. Sung-jin, she said, without looking away from Min Jae. You left the room before the screen came on. Someone told you what was coming. Who? A sound behind her. She registered it as Sung-jin shifting his weight without speaking. Who? She said again. Min Jae answered for him. Naomi. The name was a door opening onto a room she wasn't ready to enter. She came to me last night, Min Jae said. His voice was steady. She told me you knew. She didn't know the specifics, but she knew something had changed in you. She'd been watching you for 2 days, and she knew. He paused. She told me because she thought it would protect her, give her a way out before everything collapsed. Zuri turned. Naomi was still in the room. She had not left with the departing guests. had not fled through a side door, had not moved from the spot near the back wall where she had been standing since the screen came on, and her face went pale. She was standing very still with her arms crossed over her chest, and when Zuri turned and found her, she looked back with the expression of someone who has run out of positions to retreat to. Zuri walked toward her. The room noticed. People moved out of the way. Not dramatically, just the instinctive clearing of space that happens when two people are moving toward each other with obvious and specific purpose. Naomi's chin went up as she got closer, something resolving itself. The specific act of a person who has decided that the pretense is over and is choosing, at least, to stop performing. How long did you know about his plans? Zuri said. Not the affair, the business, the strategy. How long did you know I didn't know about the company, Naomi said. Her voice was raw. I didn't know what he was doing with your clients. I swear to you I didn't know that. But the rest, Naomi's jaw worked. I knew the marriage was... She stopped. I knew it wasn't just love. I knew there was strategy in it. I told myself that didn't mean he didn't love you. I told myself people could have more than one reason for doing things, and the love could still be real. And last night, I was scared. The rawness in her voice increased, cracking at the edges. I'd been scared for weeks. I didn't know how far you were going to go. I thought... She stopped. Her eyes were wet. I thought if I told him, he would find a way to stop it quietly, and nothing would have to... Explode, Zuri said. Yes. You chose him. I was trying to protect... Naomi stopped. She didn't finish the sentence because she couldn't complete it without identifying who she had actually been trying to protect, and they both understood who it was. 11 years, Zuri said. Naomi's eyes overflowed. She didn't wipe them. She just stood there and let them run. And Zuri looked at her oldest friend's face and felt something tear that she knew from the specific quality of the pain was not going to heal cleanly. I'm sorry, Naomi said. Zuri, Don't. She said it the same way she'd said it to Min-jae. The same register, the word meaning, the apology is insufficient, and I need you to know that I know it is insufficient, and we are both going to have to live with what comes after that. She turned away. The room had thinned. Maybe 60 people remaining out of the 200, the rest having made the calculation that presence at this event was now a liability rather than an asset. The screen had gone dark. Someone had cut the signal. She didn't know when. The altar stood at the far end of the hall, all that white and silver still perfectly arranged for a ceremony that had not taken place. Min-jae was talking to his father. This was the thing she had not anticipated. Not the content of it, but the fact of it. The specific image of Min-jae standing before the patriarch with his posture slightly different than she had ever seen it, slightly less controlled, slightly more son than boss. She watched the exchange from across the room. She could not hear it. She did not need to. The old man was not looking at Min-jae. He was looking at her. She held his gaze across the diminished room. He was not a man she had ever been comfortable with. There was a coldness in him that was different from Min-jae's coldness, older and more settled. The coldness of a man who had made his choices so long ago that he had stopped thinking of them as choices. He had built the thing that Min-jae had inherited. He had no moral high ground here, and she suspected he knew it. But he was the patriarch, and in the specific architecture of the Kong family, his judgment was the structure that held everything else. He stood up. He was in his 70s and his body showed it. The careful movement, the conserved economy of a man who had learned that effort should be deployed with precision. He rose from his chair, and the remaining room noticed and went quieter, and he walked across the hall toward Zuri with a deliberate pace that no one in his family would have interrupted. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face, then at her hand, which was still resting over her stomach. The child, he said. His English was formal and exact, the English of a man who had learned it as a strategic tool. It is Min-jae's. Yes. And your intention? She looked at him steadily. My intention is to raise her, without involvement from anyone in this family, if that's what I decide. The old man was quiet for a moment. You organized this exposure? Yes. And my younger son robbed the family accounts during it? Yes. He stood in silence for a long moment, looking at her with the evaluating attention of a man who had spent 50 years reading people as a professional necessity. She did not try to perform anything for him. She had used up her performance capacity. Whatever he saw was what she actually was. You are a more formidable person than my son understood, he said finally. Most people are. He nodded once. A minimal acknowledgement, no warmth in it, but no hostility either. He turned. He walked toward Min Jae. And then, in front of everyone remaining in the room, the politicians, the executives, the crime network people who had not yet left, the family members, the staff standing in the doorways trying to look invisible, the patriarch of the Kang family said the words that would restructure every hierarchy in the room. He said them in Korean, and then he repeated them in English, and Zuri understood both. "This family disavows him," the old man said. "The decisions he made here and elsewhere, the conduct and the consequences." He looked at Min Jae without visible emotion. He is no longer operating with our backing. Min Jae's face went somewhere she had no word for. The room absorbed it. Then Min Jae turned to Park Sung-jin, and the look that passed between them was a thing Zuri read instantly. The look of two men switching from one operational mode to another, the shutdown of the public proceeding and the initiation of something that lived on different terrain entirely. And Sung-jin moved toward the side door and Min Jae moved toward her. Not toward the altar, not toward his father, toward her. He came fast. The controlled ease was gone, and what moved in its place was something she had never seen in 18 months of watching him. Not polished, not performed, just direct and purposeful and stripped of every layer she had spent so long trying to see beneath. She did not step back. He stopped 2 feet from her. His eyes were clear and dark and absolutely focused. "The money my brother took," he said, low and fast. "Where is it going?" "I don't know." "You knew everything else." "I didn't know about that." He looked at her face with the specific attention of a man who had made his entire career reading people's tells, and whatever he found there, or didn't find, made something shift in his expression. "Then you need to understand what that money is connected to." He paused. "It's not family savings. The reserve accounts fund specific operational obligations, people who are owed, people who don't renegotiate." His voice dropped lower. "If my brother doesn't deliver what's in those accounts, that's not my— You are carrying my child." The words cut across hers, not loud, just precise. "And the people who will come looking for that money do not care about distinguishing between members of a family. They will look at you and see Kang." The air in her lungs went thin. Hyun-woo knew this, Min Jae said. He knew exactly what he was taking and what it meant. He knew who would come looking. He held her eyes. He ran his plan and he left you standing in the room. She turned. Hyun-woo was still near the altar. He was watching the exchange between her and Min Jae with an expression that was hard to read at this distance. And she walked toward him with a speed that was not quite running, and the room parted for her because something in her bearing made it clear that whoever got in the path of what she was currently carrying would regret it. She reached him. "The operational obligations," she said. "The accounts you emptied. Who do they belong to?" Hyun-woo looked at her. In his eyes she saw the thing she had been afraid to find. Not surprise, not guilt, but the settled expression of a man who has arrived at the point in a plan he designed and is proceeding past it into territory that he told himself he would figure out when he got there. He had not, she understood now, fully figured it out. "Hyun-woo." "It's manageable," he said. "Who do those accounts belong to?" He said a name. She had heard it once, in a context that had not required her to file it in any active part of her memory. A name that existed in the background of her 18 months in this world, the way certain things existed in peripheral vision, registered, noted, set aside because it was not immediately relevant. She filed it now, in the specific, active, highly relevant part of her memory that was currently operating at maximum. "How long before they know?" she said. "They already know," Hyun-woo said quietly. "The accounts were flagged the moment the transfer cleared. That was—" he checked his watch. 47 minutes ago. "And they'll come here. They'll come where the Kang family is," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. She looked at him with the full weight of what she was now understanding, the full scope of what he had built and what he had omitted and what he had left standing in the room. And she felt something clarify inside her that was not forgiveness, and was not surrender, and was not despair. It was something harder than all of those. She turned and looked at the room, the remaining guests moving toward exits. Min Jae's father being guided toward the back entrance by 2 family associates. Park Sung-jin gone again, already operational, already running whatever play Min Jae had initiated. The altar standing useless and white at the far end of the hall. The dark screen above it. Min Jae was watching her from across the room. She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them, the entire wreckage of the last 3 days, the last 18 months, Everything they had been to each other, and everything they had done to each other, and everything that was now moving toward them from outside this room that neither of them had fully accounted for. He walked toward her. She did not move away. He stopped 2 feet from her, and she looked up at him, and for one moment, brief and strange and entirely outside the architecture of everything that had preceded it, there was no performance between them, no management, no construction, just 2 people standing in a destroyed room, understanding that the thing coming next was going to require both of them to be something they had not been before. "I can get you out," he said, "you and the baby, tonight, before they—" "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Why would you do that?" she said. "What's the calculation?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she had not expected, in the voice she had heard only twice in 18 months. The voice underneath all the other voices. The one that came from wherever the real man lived when he wasn't running anything. "Because she's mine," he said. "And you—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I was wrong about what you were. I was wrong about what I was doing." He said it with difficulty, the difficulty of a man for whom admission costs something concrete. "That doesn't make me good, but it makes me—" The door at the far end of the hall opened. 3 men came through it. They were not guests. They were not security. They moved through the space with the specific quality of people who had not been invited and were not concerned about that and were looking for something, and they found it. And what they found was the room, and the 2 people standing in the middle of it. The 3 men stopped just inside the doorway. They were not large in the way that announced itself. That was the first thing Zuri registered. Not the theatrical size of movie enforcers, but the specific, compact economy of men who had learned that efficiency mattered more than intimidation. The one in front was perhaps 40, with a face that had been rearranged at some point in its history and had settled into its current configuration without complaint. He wore a dark coat. He looked at the room the way you look at a room when you are not a guest, cataloging exits, counting bodies, assessing the distance between himself and whatever he had come to find. His eyes landed on Min-jae. Then they moved to Zuri. Then they stayed there. Min-jae stepped in front of her. She had not asked him to. She had not expected it. He simply moved. 1 step, deliberate, placing his body between her and the 3 men in the doorway with the specific absence of theater that made it real rather than performed. His back was to her. She could see the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man who is not afraid but is paying complete attention. Park Sung-jin materialized from somewhere to Min-jae's right. She had not seen him come back into the room, but there he was, positioned at an angle that made sense only as a tactical choice, and she understood in that moment that whatever was about to happen had a shape that these men, Min-jae, Sung-jin, and the 3 in the doorway, already knew. Hyun-woo was behind her. She could hear his breathing. The man in front said a name. Korean. Not Min-jae's name. A title, a designation, the specific word that placed Min-jae in a hierarchy that had nothing to do with family or wedding ceremonies, or the business structures being dissected in whispers by the remaining guests who had not yet found their way to the exits. Min-jae answered. His voice was level. She could not see his face. An exchange followed that moved too fast and too idiomatic for her to track at full comprehension, but she caught the shape of it. The question being asked, the nature of the obligation being named, the specific word that meant tonight used twice in close succession. She caught the word for transfer and the word for incomplete, and she caught Min-jae's response, which was a single sentence delivered with the exact controlled authority of a man who is negotiating from a weaker position than he would prefer but is not going to indicate it. The man in front looked past Min-jae at Hyun-woo. "Where?" he said. In English this time, precise and accented and completely clear. Hyun-woo said nothing. "Hyun-woo." Min-jae's voice, the one underneath everything. "Where is it?" Silence stretched across the room. Zuri could hear the breath of the people still present, the ones who had been too slow or too frozen to leave, standing now against the walls like the audience at a performance that had stopped being a performance some time ago. Then Hyun-woo said, "The account transfer has a 72-hour clearing window. The funds aren't accessible for 3 days." The man in front absorbed this. "The money is there?" Hyun-woo said. "I'm not contesting the obligation. I moved the funds. I will return the funds, with whatever additional arrangement is required." He said it with a flatness that indicated he had been preparing this speech for longer than today. "I needed leverage. I used what I had. I'm not running." Min-jae turned, just slightly. Not all the way around. Not away from the 3 men at the door. but enough that his profile was visible and Zuri could see the side of his face and the expression on it, which was something she had no clean word for. The expression of a man hearing his brother offer restitution in a language that their father had probably spoken in rooms like this one. The family logic of obligation and settlement that ran beneath everything else like a root system. The man in front looked at Min-jae. Min-jae said something short and definitive. The man in front looked at the room for a long moment. Then he looked at Zuri one more time. The same flat cataloging attention, appraising something, reaching some conclusion she was not privy to. And then he turned and walked back through the door. The two men behind him followed. The door closed. The room breathed. Zuri became aware that she had been holding her body in a specific configuration, weight forward, shoulders locked, jaw tight, and she consciously released it, working from the jaw down, feeling the ache of tension in muscles she had not known were engaged. Her hands were cold. She pressed them flat against her thighs and felt the fabric of the gown and made herself remember what it had felt like to stand at the vanity this morning and make a promise to a daughter who did not yet know what kind of world she was coming into. Still working on that, she thought. Give me a few more hours. She turned to Hyunwoo. He was looking at the door where the three men had been. His hands were still at his sides. His face had the specific quality of a man who has been braced for an impact and is now recalibrating in its absence, recounting his own limbs, finding them present. 72 hours, she said. Yes. And then what? And then I return what I took, plus a settlement fee that will be substantial. He looked at her. I have resources outside the Kang network. I've been building them for 4 years. It will not be comfortable, but it will be sufficient. And the plan, she said. The whole plan. What were you actually going to do with $14 million? He held her gaze. Leave, he said simply. Leave Korea. Leave the network. Leave all of it. Start somewhere with enough capital that the Kang name and everything attached to it couldn't reach me. A pause. I was going to ask you to come. The room was very quiet now. The remaining guests had filtered out in the preceding minutes until only a handful remained. Staff, mostly, standing at careful distances, and Naomi still against the far wall, and Min-jae's father, who had come back from the rear entrance and was standing near the altar with the patience of a man who has outlasted many rooms. And Min-jae, he was still facing the door. She watched him turn around. She watched him take in the room, what was left of it, the white flowers still perfect on the altar, and the dark screen above it, and the scattered chairs and the remnants of an event that had contained his whole future 6 hours ago and now contained none of it. His face was just his face. Tired. Real. The face of a man at the end of something. He looked at Zuri. You should sit down, he said. You've been standing for 3 hours. She almost laughed. It was such a specific and absurd piece of practicality to be offered at the end of the worst day of her life. And she felt the almost laugh move through her and not quite make it out. And she walked to the nearest chair and sat down in her ivory gown and put her bouquet on the floor beside her and put her hands in her lap. Min-jae pulled a chair close and sat in it and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. It was the silence of two people who have finished performing everything they had prepared to perform and are now in the unscripted space after. I did love you, he said. That's not a play. I'm not asking you to believe it because it helps me. I'm telling you because it's accurate, and I think you deserve accurate information at this point, even if the timing is... He stopped. His jaw moved. Even if the timing is what it is. She looked at the floor beside his feet. I know, she said. He looked up. I know you loved me, she said, in whatever way you're capable of. I stopped thinking those were mutually exclusive a long time ago. The love and the using. I think you held both of them simultaneously, and I don't think you saw any contradiction, and I think that's the thing about you that I can't... She stopped. That I couldn't work with. He was quiet for a moment. The company, he said, your clients. I can walk back the involvement, give you documentation that establishes the relationships as entirely independent going forward. It would take... I don't want that, she said. He looked at her. I need to know what's real, she said. If some of those clients were only there because of your management, then I lose them, and I rebuild. That's what I do. That's what I've always done. She held his eyes. I don't want infrastructure. I want what I actually earned. Something moved across his face, complex and layered, and she thought she understood all of it. The recognition, the specific grief of a man understanding not just what he had lost, but what he had prevented himself from having, by the way he had built everything. She's going to be extraordinary, he said quietly. The baby. Yes, Zuri said. She is. I want... He stopped, started again. I know I don't have standing to ask for anything. I know there is no version of what I've done that earns me a request, but I'm not going to keep her from you, Zuri said. If you build something different, if what comes after today is actually different and not just a restructured version of the same thing. She looked at him directly. I'm not asking you to become someone else. I'm asking you to be accountable for the someone you are. Can you do that? The question sat between them. Min-jae looked at his hands, then at the altar, then at her. I don't know, he said, with the honesty of a man who has finally understood that honesty is the only remaining currency he has. I think I can try. I don't know if trying is something I do well. No, she said, but you could learn. She stood up. She walked to where Naomi was still standing against the far wall, and Naomi straightened as she approached. That old reflex, the posture of a woman preparing to receive judgment. Her eyes were dry now. She had moved past the stage of visible tears into something flatter and more permanent. Zuri stood in front of her. I'm not going to tell you we're fine, she said. We're not fine. I don't know if we're going to be fine. I need time and distance, and I need you to let me have them without contact for as long as it takes. She paused. But I also need you to know that 11 years is 11 years, and I don't have the energy to hate you. I just don't have it. Naomi closed her eyes. Her throat moved. When she opened her eyes again, the expression in them was not relief. Relief would have been too easy, but something that sat beside it, the exhausted acknowledgement of a person who has received something slightly better than they believed they deserved. Okay, Naomi said. Her voice was very small. Okay. Go home, Zuri said. Back to New York. Build a life that you chose instead of fell into. She paused. That's the only advice I have. Naomi nodded. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the exit without looking back, and the specific sound of her heels on the floor echoed through the depleted hall and then went quiet as the door closed behind her. Zuri stood for a moment in the middle of the room. Then she went to find Hyun-woo. He was near the altar, sitting on the altar steps with his forearms on his knees and his head down, and he looked up when he heard her coming and sat up straight with the automatic dignity of a man who will not collapse in front of witnesses even when he is close to it. She sat down beside him on the altar steps, not close, a foot of space between them. She sat in her ivory gown on the cold stone steps and looked out at the empty chairs and the scattered evidence of the event that had been. And she let the silence extend for long enough that it stopped being hostile and became something more like the silence of two people who are too tired for anything but honesty. You were going to ask me to come with you, she said. Yes. With the baby? Yes. And you thought, what? That I would go, after finding out how the money was acquired. He was quiet for a moment. I thought, he started. I thought once the immediate situation was resolved, once you'd had time to see that the evidence against him was real and the exposure was real, and nothing I'd used against him was fabricated, I thought you might understand the rest of it. Eventually. Understanding isn't the same as going with you. No. He looked at his hands. I know. Hyun-woo. She waited until he looked at her. The plan you built? The whole architecture of it. You were inside my life for 3 days, and you saw everything. The grief, the fear, the pregnancy, all of it. And you made a calculation about how much of my reality you needed to engage with and how much you could afford to set aside in order to do what you wanted to do. She held his gaze. Tell me how that's different from what he did. The question landed. She watched it land. She watched him absorb it without the deflection she had half expected, watched him actually sit with it the way she had asked, and she watched the answer reach his face. It isn't, he said, in the fundamental structure of it. It isn't different. No, she said, it isn't. He looked at the floor. I told myself I was protecting you from information that would compromise the plan. I told myself your part of it was clean, that you had real evidence, real grievances, that everything you put on that screen was true, which it was. I told myself I was the only one carrying the complicated part. He paused. But I made the decision about what you got to know, and that decision was mine and not yours. Yes, I'm sorry, he said. He said it the way people say things when they are not performing the apology, without the elaborate architecture of explanation, just the words, flat and direct, and offered without expectation of anything in return. She sat with it. "I know," she said finally. The same word she had given Min Jae, and she was aware of the echo, the strange rhyme of this day that had given her two men to say those words to, for reasons that were entirely different and somehow connected. "What happens now?" Hyun-woo said. "For you." She looked at the altar, the white flowers, the dark screen. "Now I go back to my office. I pull every client file, and I look at every engagement, and I figure out what I actually built and what was propped up from underneath without my knowledge. And what falls, falls. And what stands, stands." She put one hand on her stomach, a gesture that had become reflex. "I have about 6 months before that becomes secondary to everything else. If you need, I'll be okay," she said. And she meant it not as reassurance but as simple fact, the way you state things that are not in question. "I've rebuilt before. I'll rebuild again." Hyun-woo looked at her with an expression she recognized. The look he had given her in the Yeonam-dong cafe when she had answered his question about what she wanted, the look of a man encountering someone who has a clearer relationship with their own reality than he had accounted for. "I meant what I said," he told her quietly. "Not the plan, not the money, the rest of it. What I felt, what I—" He stopped. His voice was careful and precise the way it always was when the thing being said mattered more than the impression it made. "That was real." "I know," she said, for the third time that day. And this time the words had a different weight. Not the weight of belief or disbelief, but the weight of something she was filing carefully in the part of herself that would need time before it could be touched safely. She stood up. She smoothed the gown over her hips one last time. She picked up the bouquet from where she had set it on the step beside her, and she looked at it. All those white flowers, still perfect, arranged for a ceremony that had not occurred. And she set it back down on the altar with a deliberateness that felt like the closing of something. She did not look back at it. She walked toward the exit, and the hall received her footsteps and gave them back as echoes. And the winter light through the long windows was low and silver and indifferent, and she moved through it without rushing. She stopped at the door. She stood with her hand on the door handle and took one breath, all the way in, all the way out, and thought about what was waiting for her on the other side of it. Not the immediate logistics, not the car and the drive and the estate she would need to decide what to do about, not the clients and the files and the long work of reconstruction. Beneath all of that, the thing that was underneath everything, her daughter. Growing in the dark without knowledge of days, ignorant of weddings and empires and the particular cost of trusting people, accumulating herself cell by cell with the patient indifference of life proceeding regardless of circumstance. She was going to be so loved. That was the one thing Zuri was completely certain about in the entire wreckage of this day. Whatever was rebuilt, and whatever was lost, and whatever shape the future took, her daughter was going to be so thoroughly, stubbornly, unstrategically loved that nothing else about any of this was going to define her. Zuri pushed the door open. The air outside was cold and clean and tasted of the specific Seoul winter that she had come to know over 18 months. That particular quality of cold that cut straight through to the bone and was somehow clarifying rather than punishing. The city was operating at its usual volume, entirely indifferent to the specific shape of what had happened inside the hall behind her. She stood on the steps and breathed it in. Behind her, she heard footsteps. She did not turn around immediately. She took one more second for herself, one more breath of cold air, one more moment of standing in a space that was entirely her own. Then she turned. Min Jae was standing in the doorway. He had followed her out, and he was standing with one hand against the doorframe, and he was looking at her with the face she had seen only briefly across the altar. The real one. The one under everything. The tired and exposed and slightly lost face of a man who had been running a machine so long he had forgotten there was a person operating it. "Go home," she said. Not unkindly. Not to the estate. Somewhere else. Tonight. He looked at her. "The estate is mine. For now," she said. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Wry and ruined and real. "You're going to be a problem for every room you walk into for the rest of your life," he said. "I know," she said. She walked down the steps. She did not have a car. Her phone had 2% battery, and she had no plan, and the temperature was falling. And she stood on the pavement in her ivory gown and looked up and down the street with the specific absurdity of a woman who has just dismantled her entire life and now needs to figure out how to get somewhere. She started walking. 3 blocks, then 4. the cold working at her bare arms above the gown's structured top, her heels loud on the pavement, the city moving around her in its own rhythms. People looked. Of course people looked. A woman in a wedding gown walking alone on a January afternoon in Jongno-gu was not invisible. She looked back at some of them. She did not explain herself. She found a cafe, small, warm, the kind that existed in every neighborhood and asked nothing of you except your order. She went inside and stood at the counter, and a young woman behind it looked at the gown and then at Zuri's face and had the grace not to ask anything. "Americano," Zuri said. "Hot. And can I borrow a phone charger for 15 minutes? "Yes," the young woman said, and produced one. Zuri sat at a table near the window and plugged in her phone and waited for it to come back to life. And outside the window, Seoul moved through its afternoon in the flat winter light. And she put her hands around the warm cup when it arrived and sat with the heat of it against her palms and let herself be still. Her phone came back, a cascade of notifications. Ji-young twice, a number she didn't recognize. Hyun-woo's second phone, one message. She looked at Hyun-woo's message first. "I'm going to fix what I broke. All of it. That's not an ask for anything, just a statement of fact." She read it twice. Then she put the phone face down on the table. She looked out the window. The city moved. A couple passed on the pavement outside, leaning into each other against the cold, their conversation visible but inaudible through the glass. An old man walking a small dog with the patient pace of a routine that had been going on for years. A food delivery rider threading through traffic with the practiced ease of someone who had made this particular route so many times it had become automatic. Normal life. Proceeding. She thought about what came next in a practical sense. The estate, the clients, the legal dissolution of the engagement, the pregnancy appointments, the conversation she would need to have with her mother in Atlanta, who did not yet know any of this and would have opinions in abundance. She thought about the Bennett Creative Solutions client list and the audit she was going to conduct and the specific determination with which she was going to figure out, piece by piece, what she had actually built. She thought it would take a long time. She thought she was going to do it anyway. She thought about the daughter inside her, who would be born in the late summer, in the heat, which seemed right somehow, seemed appropriate for a child who was going to come into the world at the end of a season that had burned everything unnecessary away. And she thought about what she would tell her, eventually, when she was old enough for the story. Not all of it, not for a long time. But someday, when she was old enough to understand that the world was genuinely complicated, and that people were genuinely flawed, and that neither of those things was an excuse for what people did with their complications and their flaws, she would tell her daughter about the night she stood in a dark hallway and heard a word that ended one version of her life and started another. She would tell her that she had been afraid and angry and uncertain, and that she had done it anyway. She would tell her that doing it anyway was the only thing that mattered. The Americano was getting cold. She drank the rest of it. She unplugged her charger and returned it to the woman behind the counter and said thank you, meaning it. She stepped back outside. The cold hit her again, and she let it. She stood on the pavement in the ivory gown with her phone in her hand and 4% battery and the city going about its business all around her, and she thought, okay, whatever is next. Okay. She called Ji-young. Ji-young answered on the second ring. "Zuri, I know, I'm sorry for the silence. I need you to do something for me." "Of course, are you—" "Pull every client file," she said. "Every engagement, going back 14 months. I need to audit the full client relationship history. Everything. How the contacts were established, who made first approach, whether there were any third-party introductions I should look at more carefully." She paused. "I'll explain everything when I see you. Tomorrow. Can you do that?" Ji-young was quiet for a moment, the brief recalibration of a professional who has learned that when her employer calls with a voice like this, the correct response is competent efficiency rather than questions. "Yes, I'll have it ready." "Thank you," Zuri said. "I'll see you tomorrow." She hung up. She stood on the pavement and looked at the sky. The flat silver gray of it, the specific tone that Seoul wore in January like a garment it had chosen deliberately. Her breath clouded and dissipated. Her feet were cold in the heels. She found a cab. She got in and gave the driver the address of her own apartment, not the estate. The apartment in Mapogu she had maintained since before Min Jae, the apartment with the second bedroom she had been paying rent on for 18 months, mostly as a principal, a proof to herself that she had not fully moved in, that she retained the option of her own space. She had not slept there in 4 months. She was going to sleep there tonight. She leaned her head against the cab window and watched the city move past and let herself be still for the first time in 72 hours. And the motion of the car and the warmth of the heater and the specific low hum of the city at dusk worked on her the way those things work on a body that is finally safe enough to begin the work of being tired. She did not sleep, but she rested. The apartment was as she had left it, small and warm and hers. The second bedroom with its bare mattress and its single window facing the alley, and its air of a room that has been waiting patiently for a purpose. She stood in the doorway of it and looked at the bare mattress and thought about the daughter who would eventually fill it. She would need a crib, she would need to paint, she would need to make the room something other than a proof of principle. She went to the kitchen. She boiled water. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table in the dark in her ivory gown, and she drank the tea slowly and let the day settle over her in layers. The good and the bad and the complicated and the things that had no category yet, all of it finding its level in the stillness. The gown would need to be returned. She made a note of it. The Kang estate would need to be formally vacated. She made a note of that too. Min-jae would, at some point, need to be a father. That was not a note. That was a hope, with enough honest uncertainty attached to it that she was not going to write it down yet, was going to hold it loosely, was going to let it prove itself or not prove itself over the long, unscripted months ahead. Hyunwoo would need to settle what he had taken. He would. She believed that. She was not going to carry the complexity of what she felt about him, the anger and the understanding and the grief of a trust broken by someone she had needed to be trustworthy, until she had some distance from it. It would be there when she was ready. The tea was finished. She set the cup in the sink. She went to the window and looked out at the Seoul night, the lights of it, the specific geometry of the city at rest, the dark shape of the alley, and the lit windows of the building opposite, and the distant sound of traffic carrying up from the street below. She put her hand on the glass. It was cold. She could feel her own warmth conducting through it, brief and localized, leaving a faint impression that would fade when she moved her hand away. She was 30 years old, and she was standing in her kitchen in a wedding gown, and she had no idea exactly what she was building next. She had been here before. Not this specific moment, not this specific debris field, but this quality of standing at the beginning of something with no certainty about its shape. She had done it at 22 in Atlanta when she said yes to Seoul on 3 months of savings and half a plan. She had done it at 25 when Bennett Creative Solutions was 2 people and 1 client, and she stayed awake 4 nights in a row making it into something that could last. She knew how to do this. It was not going to be easy. Nothing that mattered had ever been easy, and she had long since stopped expecting it to be. But it was going to be hers, genuinely, completely, unmanaged and unstructured hers, and that made it something she could walk toward without flinching. She moved her hand off the glass. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to her bedroom and she lay down on her own mattress in her own apartment, and she looked at the ceiling in the dark, and she thought about her daughter, who was somewhere inside all of this, inside the gown and the cold tea and the audited client files and the long work ahead, growing quietly and reliably toward the world. "I've got you," she said, to the dark, to the ceiling, to the city, to whoever was listening. "I've got both of us." The city went on outside her window. And Zuri Bennett, who had walked into a dark hallway 72 hours ago, looking for a glass of water, and had come out the other side of everything, closed her eyes and let herself rest. Not the end of the story, just the end of the part that had almost broken her. The rest of it, the real rest, the rebuilt and chosen and genuinely lived rest, was still ahead. And for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid of it.